This is the Friday Forum for December 13th, 2024. This is the 224th Friday Forum in a series hosted by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. ICLR is Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more resilient to natural disasters. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Porter. I'm ICLR's Chief Engineer. I'm speaking to you from London, Ontario, traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lunapiwak, and Attawandaron people. In our last Friday Forum, Alison Bird of Natural Resources Canada told us about the rollout of Canada's new earthquake early warning system. That's the system that alerts you via your phone that an earthquake has occurred and seismic waves are approaching you, which enables you to take some self-protective action in the few seconds of advance warning that you've got. It enables elevators to stop and open their doors and other things that can reduce harm. Today will be the 15th and last Friday Forum of 2014. Our next Friday Forum will happen on January 10th, 2025. Mike Flanagan of Thompson Rivers University is going to speak to us about the 2023 fire season and how climate change is affecting fire activity and our options to coexist with fire. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, David Gregory of CoreLogic. He's going to bring us up to date on the state-of-the-art in insurance single-site risk assessment. He's going to speak about three aspects of modeling: speed, completeness, and accuracy, and trade-offs between them. I'm particularly interested in David's talk because I used to be a CAT modeler. I developed models as an employee in CoreLogic's, what you might call great-great-grandpa company, EQE International. I used to give talks like the one that David's going to give, but I gave him 25 years ago. So David is going to help catch me up on 25 years of development. David is an insurance and seismology expert. He serves as project management director at CoreLogic, where he does natural hazard and catastrophe risk assessment and is helping develop or leading the development of their risk platform. Before CoreLogic, he worked as a catastrophe modeler in the insurance industry. Now, before he begins, here's our agenda. Our webinar is going to last 90 minutes. David's going to present for about half that time, then I'll moderate questions for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I'm going to try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I'm only going to pose your first question, and then I'm going to move on to others. Then I'll circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded. ICLR is going to post David's slides and a link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know. You'll find the video and a PDF of our speaker's deck at www.iclr.org/workshops. And again, you'll find those slides up there by Monday or so. They're not up there yet. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David. Take it away.
Thank you, Keith, and thanks to the ICLR for having me today. So this talk stems from a talk that was given at the RAA conference, the Reinsurance Association of the Americas conference in Orlando in February this year. I can still say that just about this year, 2024. That I gave alongside my colleague and CoreLogic's chief actuary, Howard Kunst. Just one of the many experienced folks that I'm humbled to get to work with alongside my 11 years here at CoreLogic, not quite the 25 years that Keith mentioned there, though I do see his name still crop up on some of our documents, which is quite fun to see. This discussion focuses on excellence in insurance single-site natural catastrophe risk assessment, speed, completeness, and accuracy. Not only a mouthful, but a bit of a gaudy title that might be fitting of this festive period. I'm a humble Welshman dialing in from the London, UK office of CoreLogic today. So greetings from London, UK, as opposed to London, Ontario. And as you might expect for London, or the UK London, is suitably miserable, dark and grey in terms of the weather. So that's the weather update as well. It never changes. If we dive straight in. Today's discussion focuses on single-site NatCat risk assessment, as I mentioned, where we are today and where we are heading, with a focus on property data and its impact on the risk. As a well-known phrase, garbage in, garbage out, or perhaps rubbish in, rubbish out for perhaps UK, some Canadian folks. and how machine learning and artificial intelligence can help tackle these data issues, and what we're working on in CoreLogic to do so. Cat modeling at the single site, as well as looking at the impact on simulation period on results. So notably at the single site level, and not to spoil the session, but yes, it does really matter. If you're using single cat models for single site solutions, the simulation periods, that does really matter. And I'd just like to add that we have a very big team at CoreLogic, and my main focus is on cat risk models, and that's what I'll be more slanted towards today. But I'm an internal customer of our wider data products that we source within CoreLogic, and we utilize these data products to see how we can make the single site cat risk solutions better and portfolio cat risk solutions better as well. So just as take a bit of a step back, we have a look at the different types of natural catastrophe solutions. We have deterministic or hazard solutions. These are typically risk scores. So perhaps a 1 to 100 range, 1 being low, 100 being extreme. And we typically characterize them in blocks. So extreme, very high, high risk, etc. They're typically or traditionally focused on hazard as opposed to the different sort of vulnerability components of the building. Sometimes that's changing in more recent days. Then in the middle, we have probabilistic solutions. So these are typically cat model based and can involve live running of the risk based off input data, property characteristic data, to get to financial losses or perhaps damage ratios. And then on the right, we have forensic solutions. So this is after the event, or perhaps what did happen. We can label these products as a what did happen tool. This is part of the post-event analytics insurance companies can use, which will be covered further today, but I wanted to make sure we covered part of the puzzle of what we use them for. But as an example, after a hail event, we can utilize quite near live LiDAR data to ascertain the hazard at a risk from an actual event. So as a rule of thumb, hazard risk scores can be used for risk selection as well as up to pricing. So if we look at sort of on the left, we have screening, risk selection. In the middle, we have pricing over to sort of catastrophe risk management and maybe exposure management and portfolio risk on the right. There's been a recent move, as an example, with the California Department of Insurance, the DOI, requiring mitigation factors in pricing for California wildfire homeowner policies to incorporate mitigation factors, essentially adjustments to risk scores, if used for risk selection, if you will, based on homeowner risk mitigation effects. So we are seeing an interesting and increasing element here across solutions elsewhere, so across different perils and across different regions, perhaps leaking into sort of north of the border there into Canada at some point in the future. And then we have probabilistic models that can be used for pricing right through to portfolio risk. So an example of a screening tool, so this is based on a risk score, how you can use a risk score to essentially be an underwriting screening tool, where these give a good representative of relative risk, i.e. the higher the score, the greater the risk, nice and simple. Underwriting guidelines can be fixed around these. So essentially, we're designed to streamline the underwriting process and get to a quick underwriting result. For example, on the right, we have a score of 50 or below that essentially can be an automated writing of the risk. We don't need to be concerned for that location. For location scores 51 to 60, we may have a manual underwriting process right through to 81 to 100, which obviously is extreme risk, where in order to offer policy, either mitigation impacts by the customer, by the policyholder, will be required, or perhaps an auto decline, depending on a carrier's risk appetite, etc., and perhaps the local market. Probabilistic models take front and center for more complicated risks, larger commercial structures, for instance, but can increasingly be used on simpler risks, which we're going to be covering today. And then in terms of pricing and setting rates and premiums, risk scores can be translated into a relativity factor that increases as a score increases, essentially. So a pricing or rating relativity factor, 1.2, 1.5 times the premium, etc. The example on the right is an element of validation. This is what I typically work with the chief actuary on at CoreLogic. So this is for California wildfire homeowners business to show that the model is working as expected. This shows that not only does the model predict which other locations are the most likely to be damaged, if I can say that, but also the ones with a lack of damage, i.e. lower hazard, lower risk locations. So we have a fitted curve to the model as well. So 2021 actual relativity, the blue line, this comes from scoring every property that has been damaged. We can actually get this data from CAL FIRE for a data source, and we compare these to our actuarial analysis. So we have a damage versus modeled relativity for the entire state at that point. So we can see that both in the model and in 2021, so the blue and then the orange essentially, a property in the top decile, 91 to 100, has 17 times the damage relativity as the middle decile, 41 to 50. So 2021 was an active year for wildfires. We had Dixie, Caldor. Between them, we had over 1,000 structures damaged in each of those events. And in total, US-wide, 2.5 billion acres was notably burnt in 2021, quite a large area. As for probabilistic models, these produce loss estimates, as we know, and we can do a more rigorous model evaluation on them. So it's not just did the location get hit or not, or was it likely to get hit or not, but once it did get hit, what was the damage potential for that location? And we typically do these sort of evaluations after every major event that happens. There are more hail events, there are more wildfire events, there are less, but still quite a lot of hurricane events versus earthquake events, for example. So the more events that happen, the more validation we can do, more refinements to the solutions in the model. So validation is a common issue for single site risk, and it does require large data sets. So our solutions at CoreLogic are tested on 170 plus million parcels. This is focused on the US for now, where our data set includes building characteristics data. So every location in the US essentially is modeled as part of a validation piece. So not to be too US-centric, we are working through solution sets in Canada in a similar way, utilizing the methodologies we have for the US and replicating these north of the border. But when it comes to pricing, it really does depend on the peril and the granularity of the peril. So the larger footprint events with more homogeneous hazard over areas, they may not require the same level of locational granularity as smaller footprint events, essentially. The resolution of the model needs to match the granularity of the risk. And the main point is models are having to become better and more sophisticated, and technologically speaking, we are at a point now where in many cases they're ready to be used for single site models. We have lots of characteristics, lots of fragility curves, lots of options, allowing tens of thousands of different potential outputs for that location, depending on the age of the roof, what the structure is made out of, the year built, etc. So the models are that sophisticated now that we can start using them potentially for single site. But having higher resolution models is meaningless if we don't know exactly where the location is or what it's made out of. So we start with a single site example here. No surprises that flood risk and wildfire are considered the most granular perils in terms of hazard. Here's a prime example of how flood risk can change from property to property over very short distances. Within 70 feet, on the little image on the right, that little cartoon, this is actually coming from an actual example, but we've put the cartoon properties on for the image. Within 70 feet of each other, the elevation increases by 20 feet. So that moves the location from extreme risk to very high. That's sort of from red to orange, should we say. And in general, this heat map here, again, red is high, blue is low. That shows the granularity of the risk for flood. But even there, with advances in modeling, and in particular, if we switch perils for a second, earthquake, in terms of how we capture soils these days, earthquake has actually becoming quite a granular peril depending where you are. So when we updated, to give a Canadian reference just for a second, when we updated our Canada earthquake model to the latest GSC, the Geological Survey of Canada National Seismic Hazard Model, NSHM, 2020, we did that a couple of years ago. The hazard, and so the losses and risk change very quickly over small areas, higher hazard areas, of course, especially near river sources or coastal regions with large soil variability. The soils change a lot, but typically not always, but where you have rivers, lots of sediment being carried, etc. So the soil strength can change quite drastically over small distances. And a good example here is in Richmond, in Vancouver, in British Columbia, in large part to the Fraser River Delta, where the sediment deposits have sort of shifted the soil and the different the geological landscape essentially over many, many thousands of years. And locations as close as 200 meters from each other in proximity have a 30% change in the local hazard. So a building 200 meters away from each other has a 30% higher earthquake hazard than the building 200 meters away. That might be a bit of an extreme example, but even perils that traditionally were considered lower granularity of perils are now becoming more granular. So it's happening all across the board, essentially. The models have to be more sophisticated to capture that. But I'm digressing. Let's get back to flood. This is a good example that we like to use quite a lot here. So this is back into the US, where we have 3 different levels of geocoding, and they impact the structure level average annual loss considerably. So the only thing we're changing here is the latitude and longitude that we assign at that location. So typically, not always, but typically, if you're using a CAT model, you might have a geocoder, and you might not even realize which type of geocoding the location is being hit at. So it's either street level interpolation, which is the top one here. So that could be the letterbox or the mailbox for you guys, I think you say. So we can see this is furthest away from the main flooding source. So if you just notice there's a river going through the middle of this picture here, that's actually the main source of flooding, unsurprisingly, the river from this location. So if we take the street interpolation, we're furthest away from the flooding source. The main structure is actually in the middle, so that's where the building is. And we can see that has an AAL of $6,100. So it's closer to the water, to the hazard. So it's in a higher hazard location. And then if we took the parcel level, so the parcel centroid is obviously the full boundary of the property, not just the building. It's actually in the water, which is why we like using this one, because it's quite an extreme example. It's quite fun. But we can see that there's a factor of essentially 65 times. So is the loss 65,000 or is it 1,000? That's purely from essentially which geocoder or element you take. That's how sensitive the losses can be. We're actually going to come back to this example when we look at how numbers of simulations impact the losses. It's quite a nice one where we have essentially medium, high, and extreme risk. And of course, the more extreme you have, the more events are hitting it. In this example, every event is hitting it because it's in water, but we can see essentially what impact that has on the simulation periods. Property characteristics data is another element of our rubbish in, rubbish out. So we've looked at geocoding, look at property characteristics, and then we'll go into some CAT modeling. As a reminder, CAT models are made up of 3 components typically. We have the hazard model, the vulnerability component in the middle. That's how a building responds to a hazard, and the financial model on the right. So that's how the model translates damage into loss. So the property characteristics element is the vulnerability piece, and that's essentially the middle piece there that we're talking about. So CoreLogic collects this type of data over many years of data scraping from many, many report types. So I'm a customer of this data myself internally to CoreLogic. It's not my sort of main wheelhouse, but we get to sort of work with lots of data, and that's what we like as CAT modelers. So more recently, machine learning and artificial intelligence have been introduced to expand and validate these capabilities we have. Sticking with flood, so we have this concept of a LAG, a HAG, an FFH, and BFE. We do love acronyms across the insurance industry, but very quickly, the LAG is the lowest adjacent grade. So that's the ground elevation at the lowest point of the property. Then we have the first floor height. That's the height of the first floor above the LAG. So in this instance, it's 11 foot above the LAG, so 19 feet from, if you're thinking of it from a DEM perspective. And then we have the BFE, the base flood elevation. So this is the elevation at which water will hit in a 1 in 100 year, I should say, event. So in this example, we can see that this is 7 feet. So if we take a look here, what we're really seeing is until the water reaches the first floor height, that's where we see the real damage potential to the property from an insurance perspective. And this data, when put into models, can change the risk drastically. So we can see we're either 1 foot above the BFE or we're 12 feet above the BFE. That's a huge example of how flooding has to become quite extreme before we actually see material loss to this building. So at CoreLogic, we came up with a product called First Floor Height. I don't think we're going to be winning any marketing and prizes for the name of that one at least. But yeah, First Floor Height product. So how did we do this? So CoreLogic owns 80% of the MLS in the US. That's the multiple listing service. So it's essentially a very simple way for my brain to think about this. It's a photographic database of properties used for selling real estate. We use these unobstructed images of property, and that's the key difference. So they're views you can't get from satellite imagery, perhaps Google Maps, etc. And we calculate the height at every step up to a front entrance, and various different parameters that we can see here. So AI determines the point at which the terrain intersects the house around the whole structure footprint. So that's how we can identify the lag, the lowest adjacent grade. And it also determines the foundation type, which can be used to increase the accuracy of the first floor height estimation, i.e. if it's built on concrete or if it's built on stilts, etc., that typically has a good bearing of how much the FFH will be. So, oops, one step back. So a little bit more into how we go about building these tools. We actually first started with increasing the resolution of our digital elevation model to 1 meter. And in highest flood-prone areas, not sort of on tops of ridges, etc., where there's low hazard, which, I mean, is crazy to think about. When I started almost 17 years ago, I think we were looking at 90 meters, and 30 meters seemed unfathomable, and now we're down to 1 meter. So we're with satellite imagery, with technology, etc., we're sort of advancing these things very quickly. Then we looked at the imagery, and I find this quite interesting. We introduced semantic segmentation, which is a fancy way of saying we label each image, or each pixel in an image, so every pixel gets labeled with an object class. So nice and simple, we can say the stairs. They can be seen in the image here in yellow on the screen. So we can, every time the AI essentially sees this in an image, it can label it as an object called stairs. And we collect all these subsets of information on the images, and essentially the models can be trained then to get this data across millions of images, and then we can actually train the model to do better. So we can train them to recognize the steps, the windows, the doors, the garage doors, etc. And this essentially helps calculate the FFH across broad sweeps of properties. So we can see this, I'm going to call this a 3-story townhouse for simplicity. So we can tell the system to compare every 3-story townhouse to see similar data sets. And that's how we can reduce the sort of the machine getting the AI getting the model wrong, essentially. So this can actually help calculate the foundation type as well. So similar things, looking at garages, looking at the steps leading up to the house, etc. And we also validate this with known existing property characteristics. So essentially, we take data where we know is accurate, we manually measure, and we see if the model can actually predict it with accuracy. So that's our sort of test case, should we say. So very quickly, that's a flyby in how we sort of can build these data sets and improve these data sets in the model. And this is obviously data that we use them to in the CAP models. And because we have these solutions, we build the CAP models that are, I don't want to say good enough, robust enough, how about robust enough to use this information. So we make it that you can input first floor height into our models. We'll actually do the calculations for you as an example. So that's essentially going through hazard, geocoding, building characteristics, and essentially how we've got to the point where we have all this data and we can use it. Now we want to see, depending on the modeling that we use, does it make a difference, essentially? So the financial model is a big piece of this. Typically, CAP models were originally developed for portfolio usage. And for a number of years, I recall being part of discussions or watching discussions on stage at various conferences, the number of years you need for robust CAP modeling. And we have taken a look at this for location level, but traditionally we always spoke about this from a portfolio level perspective. So, 2 seconds, sorry. CoreLogic uses a 300,000 year simulation set in our catastrophe risk modeling. At a high level, a longer simulation set, if designed properly, can have more robust capture of losses. So 2 major benefits, just to keep it nice and high level, both in terms of frequency. So more samples, a longer simulation set allows for more events to be sampled in terms of geography. So this avoids locations being left out of a cat model or underrepresented in the risk. I like to think of it as a Swiss cheese effect, where you might have the lower simulation, you might have more holes in your data set and the geographic coverage, essentially. Where if you look at a single location, there may be geographic holes. At the portfolio level, you might have covered enough of it, essentially. So that's why it's more important for location level to have a fuller simulation set for obvious reasons. If you happen to have a location in your Swiss cheese hole, it's going to be underrepresented in the risk. And then severity benefits. So once a location has been hit, a larger simulation set allows for more samples to be selected along the severity distribution. And this captures uncertainty and severity. And uncertainty is the cornerstone of all cat modeling. The more simulations we can throw at something, as long as the model is designed with sufficient detail, of course, then there's less chance that we're going to be leaving something out, essentially, capturing more of the uncertainty. So there's a hit or miss element, essentially, and also if it's hit, how much? Or are we covering enough of the samples? So it can't be the more simulations, the better, because there has to be a business need as well. Essentially, downstream tools from cat modeling that give rise to a need for lower number of simulation years. It takes too long, essentially. The more simulation years you have, the longer it takes to run. These typically have business needs and fast turnaround times. Especially with a focus on portfolio risk, we have integration needs for downstream DFA tools, dynamic financial analysis tools, for capital modeling, essentially. And we work with clients on sort of what the right number is for a portfolio. But we're turning our attention here to single site cat modeling and the impacts of the number of simulation years on losses at a single site. So we talked about making the data good enough for detailed cat models, but once there, how detailed do these cat models need to be? Which leads us to the question, in using a subsample simulation set, how much uncertainty is introduced to the loss at the location level, and we've also going to do it at the portfolio level, because that's what we traditionally have done these for. So just to talk through sampling and subsampling, I've got an image here which hopefully breaks it down quite simply. Let me get my animation working, 2 seconds. Come on. That's what happens when you rely on live. 2 seconds. There you go. Apologies for that. So the white boxes here represent our 300,000 years. Please don't count them. It's just a dummy example. First, I decide how many samples I need in a subset. So how many is enough? So 25,000, 50,000, 100,000. The animation here is showing how much of the catalog is being ignored by using a smaller simulation set. And then we have to think about which sample to select. So here we can see different sample selections we can make. It's in a matrix. So we can select the first one, we can omit the second, we can select the third sample, etc., etc. There'll be millions of potential subsets of examples in this. So which one's the right one? And also, does any of it matter? So random sampling methods should suffice. The catalog, the stochastic catalog is truly random, but we do need to be concerned about perils that cluster in years. So anything that's seasonal, so all the weather perils essentially are seasonal in a way. So we do have to sort of bear that in mind. But for this example, we're going to be looking at random samples events. And if we see here, this is an example of how we can select different 100,000-year sample sets. So for this study, we've iterated many, many subsets of simulations. We haven't tried all of the interpretations because our computers would break. You'd probably bring down the servers. But we've looked at many, many, many different interpretations of each subsampling set. So if we only select 25,000 out of 300,000 years, what difference does it make to the losses at the location level? And what we want to get to is essentially, does simulation size in cat modeling matter at the single site level? And if it does, how material is the variance in loss? How much is the loss? The loss is going to vary by, bearing in mind we take less samples. And maybe one step further, is there an optimum sample size we should be using? So to look to answer those questions, I'm going to go straight to the summary before we look at any of the exhibits. But the impact does depend on peril, geography, and frequency. Of course, for single sites, we're seeing depending on which subsample we select. Swings in average annual loss of more than 10% are common. Return period losses, your 1 in 100, your 1 in 200 year, we're seeing 20% or greater swings, and even higher when considering gross losses with high deductibles or low sublimits. So maybe excess and surplus type business, or sort of risky, the high risk business. Maybe the earthquake peril is a good example, with 10-15% deductibles being seen in sort of the BC area. The largest impact is always seen consistently in the tail of the risk, so the more extreme, which might not be surprising. For all perils, we site level output sees higher variances in loss than portfolio, which is probably not too much of a surprise. So let's take a look at some of these exhibits of what work we've done on this. So I'm back to our earlier flood example. That's a nice one to start with. This is a representative example, ground up loss, buildings only. This is similar in what we see across perils, which we'll take a look at in a second. But this changes we see in subsampling are effectively a play on the relative frequency versus severity of loss for that peril. And the frequency tends to play a big part in how much these losses are varying. So we've talked about the hazard scores we have before with different score buckets. So essentially, we're looking at this as a mock-up of how much the CAT model losses vary based on a moderate risk property, essentially. So these three locations we're going to look at. We'll see the difference in the impact of different simulation sets has the losses at each of the locations. We've mentioned we can see the river in the middle of the map there. So this the one we're looking at now is furthest away from the river of the three. In the graph on the right, I'll explain this one because we're going to look at a lot of these graphs over the next sort of 10 minutes. So I'm going to explain this one quite well, and then we'll skim over the next ones because we'll understand it after that. Because I appreciate it's quite a lot to look at, perhaps, when you first look at it. So the graph on the right, we have the navy line, which is the OEP curve, the occurrence exceedance probability curve from a full 300,000 year set. So essentially, we can see our 200-year loss is around $25,000, right up to our 500-year loss, which is just over $110,000 for this location. So rather than show loads and loads and all the different samples that subsamples we selected, what we've done is shown the variation essentially. So we've calculated the variation defined as the coefficient of variation at each return period, and we've plotted a cone of uncertainty, trying to keep it a little bit simple, or the variation of the losses. So what we mean by that is if we pick a 25,000-year simulation set at random, the red, orange, and yellow represent the range of possible losses I could get at the 68th percentile, so roughly 2/3 of the time. So essentially 2/3 of the time I randomly select 25,000 years, I'm going to get a 200-year, a 51% variance of what the loss can be at the 200-year return period. That means there's a 1/3 chance it could be more than a 51% variance. So we are seeing really material differences in CAT modeling output depending on subsampling or using a lower simulation set, essentially. The more simulations we have, so looking at sort of some broad concepts here, the more simulations we have, the cone of uncertainty narrows. So the orange and yellow represent a 50,000-year subset variation, and the yellow on its own represents a 100-year subset. So if we selected 100,000 years out of 300,000 years randomly, the 200-year loss will be within 22% if we use the full set. So we're seeing material to double-digit percentage impacts. So, you know, sometimes we're focused on the rubbish in and the rubbish out in terms of the data capture, you know, where the lat long is in terms of geocoding. But purely from a simulation standpoint in the financial model, we can see 50% variance just from using a lower or less robust, should we say, simulation set. Yes, we can see the variation is quite large, 50%, 51%, 36%, 22%. Interestingly, as we go into the tail of the curve, we're seeing less variance in this example. So typically for this curve, it's less steep, I'm going to say. So in terms of the loss curve, essentially, I don't want to say we're capping out, but we can see the damage is not steep compared to other examples we're going to look at now. This is the moderate risk category. It's the lowest risk category we're going to be looking at overall. And that's typically what we're seeing in these areas. If we move to location 2, so just very quickly, I'll go back and forth. So you can see this one's far more steep. The loss curve is more steep. The water's sort of hitting the property more as we get into extreme. And you'll notice that the big relationship changes here essentially are that in the tail, it matters more in the lower return periods. So as long as the hazard continues to increase, the variances will continue to increase. Again, quite a simple concept. When we think about it, it makes perfect sense. But the proof is in doing the maths in the pudding, essentially. And that's what we've done here. So this, of course, is a high-risk structure for flood, but we see similar patterns across the perils. Anything that's moderate, high, very high risk, as long as the EP curve is steep, we see the loss sort of increasing in the extreme return periods. This is the pattern we typically see. The number of simulation sets really does matter more. So we can start to see losses around the 50 to 100 year in this one. You can see the differences grow. We see these low double-digit percentage variations in loss at the 200 year, and these get larger in the tail. That's the main point. Yeah, I think this one, I think that covers everything on this one. I'm just going to go to our extreme one. So this is the comical one almost. But we do see this in reality, perhaps more on locations that have sublimits as opposed to locations built in the water. But this is an example of extreme cat modeling risk. So where you're getting to a total loss, in this example, it's within 200 years, we get to a total loss, but we see very, very steep gradients. So 50% loss in 40 to 50 years. And we sort of see loss straight off the bat for even at the 10-year, 20-year, etc. So what we can see here is that as soon as we reach total loss, on the right there, all models converge and we see 0% variance no matter what simulation subsample set we take. Again, nice to prove these things from a mathematical standpoint, but perhaps you're less likely to see this in the real world example of cat risk modeling in terms of price risks that you're pricing. But interestingly, as we get to 100%, so on the way up to our 100% total loss, the variances are huge. The lower the sample simulation set we see. So anytime you have a sublimit, or if you're modeling, the sublimit's the best example here actually, you're going to see huge variances in losses based on the sampling simulation set you have. So the more sophisticated potentially the policy in high risk territory, the simulation years does really matter, essentially. So that's, hang on a second, let's go back there. So that's our single site example, but what about portfolio? So it's often argued, it's worked in practice, that portfolio less simulations are needed. So we've argued that 25, maybe 50,000 years is enough for a portfolio level view of loss. And we can actually see that true in these exhibits as well that we've got on the screen here. Actually, I should probably take a step backwards. It's up to a carrier to define what their materiality level is and how much they can sort of accept a variance of loss. But single-digit percentage changes are by and large potentially permissible. And we can see that regardless of whether using 25,000, 50 or 100,000 year subsets, typically at the portfolio level, we're seeing single-digit percentages. So it matters less the portfolio than the single site, which is what we've always known, but nice to prove the point. But flood is a high gradient peril. We know this, we discussed this. Earthquake, let's take a look, took an example for that. So here is an example for California earthquake. To be honest, this could be akin to probably a Vancouver type policy to sort of make it more relevant for Canada. Probably see a very similar outlook here. Typically, these would have a chunkier tail and lower losses at lower return periods just because of the frequency of the earthquake peril relative to a high risk flood peril as a comparison. But we can see here the ground up damage on the left, but the variances are smaller than for flood, at around 70% for 25,000 years, 11% for 50,000 years, and 8% for 100,000 years. So less material, essentially. But when we think about the insurance policy terms in California and Canada for earthquake, we're seeing deductibles between 10, 15, 20% perhaps. If we were to model this with a 15% deductible, we currently get the variances on the right. So again, showing that as soon as we slap on these high deductibles or potentially sublimits, the variances in the simulations become very material, even for what's traditionally considered a lower granularity peril, where at the portfolio, you might get away with, inverted commas, a lower simulation set. And now we look at the portfolio. So the single site's the same on the left, and now we have the portfolio view on the right for earthquake. Again, as we've always sort of discussed in these conferences going forward, you could probably get away with a lower simulation set if you wished for on a portfolio. And last, we have our wildfire. So I quite like this exhibit. I call it the matchstick exhibit, which is quite apt for wildfire. Happens to be in a high hazard area of California, but it's the nature of the peril that gets us to these relationships. So at basic level, not always, but wildfire can be a bit more binary in its damage potential. Something doesn't burn and has zero loss, or something is exposed to extreme heat or actually burns and the loss rises very steeply. Bit of an oversimplification, but if you go with me on that one, that's good. We are actually ignoring smoke damage here. So we do include this in the model, but it really does mess up the relationships we see in the losses. So and how they contribute to the loss. And essentially the variance signals get confusing. So we're focusing on the main perils here, just in all examples. We've got our matchstick example on the left. That's very apt for wildfire, where we see the number of simulations matters immensely. So as soon as we start seeing loss or material loss, this happens regardless of whether losses start rising with the return period. When we looked at other examples, when the curve rises steeply and doesn't cap out at 100% damage ratio, the losses are very sensitive to number of simulations. So as you can see here, we're looking at extreme variances of 500-year return period. The loss variance goes, essentially, is the loss $300,000 or is it $550,000? So if we select a random 25,000 years, and as a reminder, this is to within one standard deviation, so a third of the time the losses would be even more higher or lower than that. Looks very important. So on the right there, we have the losses from the portfolio. So this is the California-wide insurance exposure database that we have in CoreLogic that we model it against. And we can see, yet again, the loss variances are much less sensitive to simulation periods compared to, obviously, at the single site. So, delved into a bit of high-level stats for a Friday morning, apologies. But essentially, I hope you've enjoyed this flyby today. We've covered three things at the heart of single-site risk assessment and essentially where the models and the input data are getting more sophisticated to the point of being used together. So we have the data, we now have the models that are sophisticated to use that data. But by and large, for CAP modeling single-site risk assessment, simulation period does matter. The more samples, the better. We saw that across the board, though it does depend on what kind of variance you consider material, typically. And rather unsurprisingly, better data and better models leads to more robust and, dare I say, better results. So we are getting to the point where all of this can be calculated from just an address. So we manually calculated all these by hand, but we know the property characteristics. We have the structure level geocoding. We have replacement cost data. We have CAP modeling solutions, and we can just calculate the rest on the fly. So again, I'm going to sort of take one more time to thank Keith and the ICLR for having me today, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, David. That was great. I laughed at least a dozen times during your talk. It was a very engaging talk. We don't have any questions from our attendees, but I have plenty, so we can wait while people think up, decide what they want to ask you. First of all, I was very pleased to see that the California Department of Insurance is requiring, you didn't use the term rating factors, use they require insurers.
Yes, yeah.
Right. So they require insurers to account for fire resilience attributes of the assets in setting rates, right?
Yes, yeah, essentially, yes.
Can you tell me more about that? I mean, this is I know that Florida's done this and Alabama's done this for hurricanes. It's the first time I've heard that California's doing this for fire. Can you tell, like, what are the factors?
Yeah, actually, I if you don't mind, I'll tell you what we have worked on at CoreLogic, as opposed to me misrepresenting grossly but the CADOI. And I will admit that a colleague of mine works on this far closer than I. But essentially, what traditionally we've had are hazard-based risk scores. So they actually focus on 1 to 100, whether you have the wildfire risk score purely based on a hazard basis. And then you have different factors that can affect the hazard, which are essentially property character. In my mind, property characteristic data. I'm not saying for a second that the DOI says that or CoreLogic as a whole says that. I'll keep this personal for now, just my opinion. But essentially, things that can flammable objects that connect to the house, like in my mind, picket fences, etc. If that was made of a non-flammable material, I'm going to say from a risk score perspective, that reduces the risk to the property materially. Some of it's about cleaning vegetation, so essentially keeping your house in order, making sure there's no vegetation that reaches the house. And there are several factors essentially that are at a high level, and I'll keep it that level for now.
Okay.
Where a flammable material is connected to the house or not does impact the risk materially. So that's some of the work that we've done on that to make sure that sort of adds to their impact. But I'll leave it there. But
Okay, thanks. Let's see. I was also very interested in the fact that you have examined the property attributes of 170 million U.S. parcels. Were those so? For those parcels, you showed us pictures of AI recognizing parts of the building, the stairs, the windows, the elevations, and so on. Um, Can you tell us more about the attributes that you are trying to recognize there? And I'm particularly interested in whether are you using the National Structure Inventory at all, or are you relying on your photographic database? Well, let's start there.
yeah. So essentially, we rely on any data source we can get our hands on. But we do have our internal data sets, which we regard as the crown jewels of the CoreLogic data asset base, shall we say. So the idea is that we can use this data. We also scrape data from sort of, I'm going to say the old-fashioned way from 30, 40 years plus ago, where if someone was to apply for a mortgage, etc., we would have a lot of this data filled in. We manually, well, a lot of people over a long time manually scrape this data into a database. Now we're corroborating this sort of manual way of collecting data with machine learning, AI, imagery, and everything else. And we can match the two, or in most cases, I hope we can match the two. And if not, that means something needs to be fixed. But in terms of the data we capture, we've captured up much more than I'm aware of. I think we have over 130 characteristics of property characteristics, which are useful for many different industries. My laser focus is cat risk, so I tend to be sort of look on the things that are vulnerability, that affect the vulnerability of a property. In terms of sort of what we've used AI and ML for to date, obviously we have the first floor height product that we built. So the stairs leading up to the front door is a key indicator of that. The foundation type is a key indicator because if it's essentially built on something that's it's gonna naturally have a first floor height, and there'll be steps built up to there. Garage will be potentially there because there'll be a ramp or not for the car to get into the garage, and they want to be able to get into the garage. So there's a bunch of things like that where we collect, and then obviously window openings is useful for hurricane and wind exposure, and then more recently roof types, which obviously is a very large indicator for damage for hail, for the hail peril, and anything that we can identify where cladding might be flammable or not, which again is something that's trainable. We can't necessarily identify what material it is. We can identify what it looks like, and then we can match multiple things from there.
That's really challenging because from the street, you can be standing in real life in front of a building, and if you're 20, 30 feet away from it, you can see things that could be vinyl siding, they could be wood, they could be fiberboard, fiber cement, and you don't really know until you walk up and knock on it. So that I can imagine that was very challenging.
I think that's why we have our manually scraped database as well to check and contrast. And
Right.
that's where I speak. I'm very humbled by speaking to the amount of data scientists we have sometimes and the methods they come up with. I truly do not understand fully, but I'm a very happy user of this output to make the CAT models more sophisticated.
Gotcha, understand. So one of our attendees asks, is there a difference in the granularity of data between the US data set and the Canadian data set?
In terms of what we have at CoreLogic, yes, definitely. I'd say obviously US is our bread and butter. We do have similar data sources on Australia and New Zealand. Again, different offices, quite a large company. There's 6,000 of us scattered across the globe. Then I know that Canada is high on the list. Yes, next essentially. So looking at north of the border now that we have our US data set complete.
Let's see. Here's sort of an insider baseball question. Just because I've long been interested in the relationship between how to quantify uncertainty in portfolio loss, considering the uncertainties that are within the model and that we sometimes call endogenous, and uncertainties that are outside the model, the exogenous ones. And I was thinking about, how it's hard to get every source of uncertainty into a model. You've got uncertainties, at least in my day, we had uncertainties in um, asset valuation and in assignment of building type and in the claims adjustment process, where you could have two adjusters come in, look at a public adjuster or a private adjuster come in, look at the same building, they come up with two different claims amounts. And I wonder, at what point do these exogenous, these outside, and I honestly don't know which of those are outside your model and which you've brought into the model. But at what point do you say, okay, more and more simulations, they'll start to achieve a sort of an illusory accuracy, because the exogenous uncertainties are, kind of swamping whatever you think you're getting rid of with more and more simulations. But can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think delusional certitude is something that comes up quite often. We kid ourselves that because one of the samples out of 300,000 was correct, that means there's value in that, right? So from a mathematical standpoint, that holds true. Like if we can capture reality once, then we've done, from a mathematical standpoint, not from a commercial standpoint, we've done our job. We've managed to replicate reality because there's so
Mhm.
many different things that can happen each year. That to me would be a skillful model, shall we say. In terms of my cat model practical brain, having one simulation that's right and 299,999 are wrong, that doesn't really help you from a practical standpoint. So yeah, I understand that, and I even can see that obviously having one that representative of reality is not the whole point, shall we say? But it's the amount of uncertainty you put into your portfolio that does increase uncertainty coming out of the model. So
Mhm.
what we can do potentially is lock down that piece of the puzzle, right? So the amount of portfolios we see where year built isn't provided. So we don't know whether the building was built to code in 2020, where we've learned a lot of lessons from recent events, depending on the peril, of course. There's what, 3 earthquake building code updates in Canada in West Canada, British Columbia, over the last sort of 15, 20 years. That can change loss potential hugely, right? It's either going to be a perfectly fine building or it's going to be a destroyed building, depending on the hazard, etc. So typically, if the models are they're sophisticated enough, and I believe we are getting to the point where they are now, we can reduce uncertainty by increasing the accuracy of the inputs.
Mhm.
But we're always going to have that basis uncertainty in the outputs, of course. Is the 200-year 1 million or 5 million? That's where
Mhm.
the modeling uncertainty is not going to go away.
Right. Let's see. Another sort of I've just got a bunch of insider baseball questions, because I've been down in the weeds there, developing these models. But another one is that I and others, like a colleague Bill Graff in Los Angeles, have noticed that uncertainty, the coefficient of variation in loss for a single asset or for a portfolio, tends to decrease as the mean loss increases. Your figures are a little bit clearer about standard deviation. You had the numeric values in your charts, but your figures were clear about how the standard deviation or the coefficient of variation narrows as you go up in number of simulations.
Mhm.
But I'm sort of interested in how whether the thing that Bill and I have independently seen and that uncertainty seems to decrease with the mean loss, whether you've observed the same thing or something different, or whether that has come up.
Yeah, so COV being quite literally standard deviation divided by the mean. So if
Yeah.
your denominator is higher, then typically your CV is going to be lower, but purely based on that. So on the basis that if you look at Florida hurricane versus New York hurricane, if you pick a house and put them there,
Yeah.
your COV is going to be 2 for Florida, it's going to be 10 for New York. And your mean is going to be much higher in Florida and much lower in New York. And it's from that perspective, and answering just from one piece of the puzzle,
Yeah.
frequency is a huge driver there. So there are, I would be put on the spot, but there are a lot more hurricanes that track through Florida than through New York. So you're more certain that you're going to be hit, which means your mean tends to be higher. That's typically the case where frequency is a driver of that mean relationship with standard deviation COV.
But presumably the standard deviation could increase with the mean as well, and the coefficient of variation could go up, it could go down, it could stay constant. It just sort of seemed to us that it goes down with higher mean loss. It's not important. It's a trivial sort of interesting thing. Let's see. Unfortunately, most of my questions here are insider baseball. Can you just, I guess the biggest one is, can you sort of tell us what uncertainties, because so much of your talk was about uncertainty. Can you tell us what uncertainties are inside your model? Just pick a peril, maybe it's, fire or earthquake, whatever you feel more comfortable with. What uncertainties are inside your model and what ones are outside, and what ones would you like to bring from the outside to the inside?
Okay. Earthquake's probably my first passion, so I'll stick with earthquake if I may. We're cursed and blessed with earthquake in that we don't have that many of them, touch wood, that we still don't. So we tend to rely more on the science, what we've learned, and on the research, and then perhaps more academic-based research on the few events that we have. So different interpretations of the same data, essentially. We have the National Seismic Hazard Models, and we essentially incorporate all of the certainty and uncertainty metrics there. Essentially, it's logic tree based. So
Mhm.
you have thousands of branches of it may be this, it may be that, keeping it nice and
Yeah.
simple, high level. And so what happens when you have a lot of maybe this, maybe that, when you get to the 10th decision tree or logic tree, you're down to a 1% probability of all of those 5 different connecting and pieces of uncertainty versus going this way in the branch, essentially. So that's where we get these lots of interpretations of what could happen. So we might get 1 out of 300,000 that's representative reality, but that means that we're clouding the overall mean by giving the 299,999 versions of not reality, but it could have been reality. So to me, we do a good job at, well, if the model's sophisticated enough, and that's where the simulation periods come in, we can capture a lot of this actually uncertainty that's baked into the models. That said, the National Seismic Hazard Models themselves, there's always more that can be done, and there's a lot more research going on to that. A big one for earthquake, particularly in the US and Canada, would be directivity. We know that north-south or south-north rupture plane, essentially, or starting point, can change losses dramatically. It tends to push the highest ground motions either into a large, like San Jose, as an example, a large population base, or further away from it. That alone is not quite addressed as a probabilistic standpoint in National Seismic Hazard Model or a CAT model, but that could be a difference between a $30 and a $60 billion insurance industry event. Just that sort of, I'm in my head, I'm on the Hayward Fault there, kind of pushing down to the south, north-south in California. Similar example could be on the Cascadia subduction zone affecting sort of British Columbia as well.
Mhm. Let's see. Uh, um, okay, one last in the weeds technical question. Um, Uncertainty in the, I call it the loss exceedance curve. You called it something else. Um, uh, Uncertainty in the loss exceedance curve sort of is a description of probability, right? The probably because you say, okay, the 500-year loss is the loss that has, a 0.2% chance of
Mm.
being exceeded in a given year. So you're saying sort of the 99.8 percentile of loss is this. And then if you're giving uncertainty on that, you're saying, well, the 99.8th percentile could be from this to this. So our, you can give you can say, well, with 25% confident with the with 25% confidence, the 99.8% loss exceedance is this many dollars. This probability on probability starts to make people's heads spin. And there's sort of two major schools of thought when it comes to probability. I don't know if we have any actuaries in the room today, but two major schools of thought when it comes to how you characterize probability. One is um, a frequentist. There's a real thing called probability out in the world, and we are trying to measure it. And the other school of thought is Bayesian. Probability is a degree of belief in a thing. Frequentists are perfectly happy with probability of probability, and the Bayesians, you know, their steam starts to come out their ears when you talk about probability and probability. And I think that some actuaries are in one group and some actuaries are in another group. Do you ever like get into arguments with one group or the other group about probability on probability?
Um, I'm not sure if I'm too clever or not clever enough to get into many arguments with actuaries. I'll leave you to decide which is which. Um, I would say more, if anything, I would say perhaps more on the underwriting side, we see more, let's call them challenges, as opposed to arguments,
Okay.
where the belief in the models, so underwriters being more in the field, understanding the risk from a practical 10-year, 15-year, 20 years history, etc. They have a view of reality based on that sort of 15, 20-year cycle. And there we seem to see far more challenges with the models, which of course are usually or hopefully built on a larger time scale with data from, I mean, from paleoseismology, you can go back thousands of years. So just because there hasn't been an event in a certain locale in the last 20 years doesn't mean it's not theoretically possible. And that's where we get into these lots of the probability type theories, especially when one event proves that a model, I hate to use the word model wrong because all models are wrong. Some are useful, of course,
Yeah.
but especially where we have market defining events. For instance, there wasn't a tsunami model for Japan or anywhere really commercially available before 2011, and then Tohoku happened, and then all of a sudden, 3 years later, we now appreciate that losses from tsunami can exceed ground shake. Christchurch is a good example of how liquefaction got put into models. Um, Hurricane Andrew, Ike, etc. We've learned from each event. Sometimes most of the time we learn that the models, how do I say this more accurately? Usually it's the bad events that teach us the most, of course, and that potentially pushes the models higher. So it's almost something that we're missing a piece of the puzzle as opposed to we have it already,
Right.
basically, as reality tells us, hang on, you forgot about this component.
Right. That's
But
how I
yeah.
get to my exogenous uncertainties. Um, all right, let's step back. What's next? What's coming in the next 5 years that our audience should be excited about?
Um, oh gosh, I hope it's coming in the next, well, perhaps before the next 5 years, but from micro element, if I may be so bold to speak from CoreLogic standpoint, we are far more. So I joined when we were still at Aquacap brand. So when you were here, Keith, was it 25 years ago? I joined for 3 months as Equicat, and then we became CoreLogic. So I'm part of the CoreLogic family now.
Okay.
But it does take a long time for a company to fully integrate and understand what each other does. And after 11 years, I finally have a somewhat understanding of what other areas do, but still no complete understanding after 11 years. But now we're really seeing sort of far more integration between our different data sets and what we can use, especially as AI and machine learning have sort of become front and center. We're looking for reasons to use it as opposed to reasons not to use it. And I probably see us getting to a point where if you have an address, we can fill everything else in for you, from
Mm.
everything from number of bathrooms to zero risk to earthquake risk to an average annual loss to a 100-year loss. And actually, we'll have all the input data as well, so we can reduce that
Mhm.
uncertainty that we've been talking about. I hope it's within the next 5 years, but
Mhm.
insurance and cat modeling can take a little time to get things done. But yes, I think that's probably the biggest exciting thing for me.
That does sound really exciting. Well, we've gone through all my questions, and our attendees don't have any additional questions. So I think we can call it a day. I want to thank you again. This was a great talk. I very much enjoyed it. And I want to remind our attendees that our next speaker is on January the 10th. Mike Flanagan from Thompson Rivers University is going to be talking about the 2023 fire season. So I hope you all tell your friends, I'll see you then. And in the meantime, have wonderful holidays and relaxing and peaceful new year. Thanks, David. Thanks,
Thank you so
everybody.
much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.